Well, welcome. My name is Sharmila Murthy, and if you look at your program, you'll notice that I am not Charlie Clements, who is the Executive Director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. I'm a fellow at the Carr Center, and Charlie at the last minute had to be out of town, and so asked me to step in his stead, and it's my real pleasure, actually, to serve on this panel and to moderate this panel. And I think you all can understand the very interesting conversation that we're going to embark on together, and especially given how nice of a day it is outside and how few these are in Cambridge, I think it speaks a lot that we have such a crowd here. I thought we might actually start off, since we're talking about migration and labor rights in an inclusive economy, just to actually do a little group survey before we even get started, which is how many people were born outside of the U.S.? Raise your hands. And how many of you, your parents were born outside? Keep your hands up. How many of you, your parents were born outside of the U.S.? And how many of you, your grandparents were born outside of the U.S.? So I think that for most of us, the issue of migration is front and center in our lives. These are stories that we have lived. And I think for many of us, we're here because we want to know, how can this story of migration that we've all been a part of, how can we ensure that that's a story that is a positive one for the millions of people who are living in poverty and living on the fringes? And I think today, our panelists, we're going to have a fantastic panel. We're going to start off with Michelle Klein-Sullivan, who's the Director of Migration Policy and Research at the International Organization for Migration, and it's going to start us off by talking about the history of migration. And I think the organization, looking at their website, has a very interesting role in that history being created in the wake of World War II. And she has a very impressive background, having been an attorney at the State Department and with a law degree and a master's in foreign service from Georgetown. We're then going to turn it over to Kevin Cassidy from the International Labor Organization, and is going to be sharing with us and drawing on his over 28 years of experience working in development, working with the UN agencies, both with the ILO and with other UN agencies like the UN peacekeeping operations. I believe you're involved in the Landmines Treaty. And it's going to be really sharing with us both about migration patterns, but then the real question of labor rights, and how do we actually protect labor rights while trying to grow the economy. And then finally, we're going to be turning it over to Muzaffar Chisti, who is with the Migration Policy Institute at the New York University Law School. And interestingly, is going to be bringing the conversation back home. And he is a lawyer by training, and but over the last 10 years, and I've looked at some of the titles of his writing, has really seen the evolution of migration and immigration in the U.S. in the wake of 9/11, in the wake of measures like 287G, which has brought federal enforcement down to the local level, police powers, immigration powers, and is going to also talk about the push and pull factors of what really is driving the debate, which in the U.S. is right now an incredibly controversial debate. And I'm hoping that through this panel, we're really going to touch on four main themes throughout the panel. Number one is, what are the forces that have led to global migration? The push factors, the pull factors. Number two, what historically has been the response at the global level and at the national level? And I think people are going to be touching on different aspects of that. Number three, what are the real barriers and challenges? And I think many of us probably can recognize what some of those challenges are, the tremendous governance gaps that exist, but what are they? And then finally, let's try to think creatively. What might be possible solutions? Because being here at the School of Public Policy, sitting in the room around us are future leaders of countries, future leader of international organizations, and the question is, what are we going to go out in the world and how are we going to help ensure that there's inclusive growth? So with that, let me turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you very much, Sharmila. That was a great introduction. I wish I had that recorded. It was wonderful. Really. It's rare to find someone who sets the scene so well. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation to be able to be with you today and talk about these issues. As Sharmila said, I'm going to start from really a global perspective and look at how migration is seen in relation to development. and how that thinking has evolved in a very significant way over the past 10, 20 years or so. And then to say, actually, that we're at a really critical juncture in the global response to migration as a force for development. There'll be some interesting things coming up in the next year or two that you might want to focus your attention on, because there's real opportunities for making some real progress here. So that's basically the level at which I'm going to be talking. I do have a presentation from me. I'm not going to be reading from it. Please don't worry, I'm not going to be staring my head down in my computer. It's just a bit of a prompt because I unexpectedly only flew back from Geneva last night and wasn't able to print out. So with that, let me start. Migration and development. In the 60s, and that's really where I'm going to start. Actually, let me start a little bit earlier, where Sharmila started us, with the Second World War. IOM, the International Organization for Migration, as I was discussing with some of you at lunch, was established following the Second World War at the same time that the High Commission for Refugees was. When the international community said, we have a problem here with the movement of people after the persecution of the Second World War. There were a lot of people left in the displaced persons camps. There were countries in Latin America that wanted more population. There were people who were really fundamentally disenfranchised by their own governments, couldn't live there peacefully. And so these systems, these organizations were set up, both the Refugee Convention, UNHCR, and IOM more as an operational agency at the same time to help facilitate the legal, safe, orderly integration of people into new societies and help them start their lives. Well, that was thought of at the time to be a temporary phenomenon. These organizations would last for about 5 years and then they wouldn't be in need anymore. Well, then their world happened, and there's been successive issues over the last 50, 60 years, which have shown that there are situations involving the movement of people that really do require international concern and attention. For many of the last 50 years, and particularly when we still had the Cold War, a lot of that was seen through the framework, the lens of governments persecuting their own people, largely in a global context, an anti-communist view, and that the system was set up to help people not only leave their own countries, but to find protection when their own countries weren't protecting them. There wasn't as much done on the migration side, and what I mean by that is when people move, not necessarily because of persecution, not necessarily because of war, but for a whole host of reasons, which may vary even within the individual person. You may be looking to rejoin a family, or there's a job opportunity or an educational opportunity. We all know that there's massive disparities, not only in population across the world, but also in opportunities. The same job in two different countries can earn 20 times the same rate, and it creates a massive pull factor as well as a push factor. So demographics, opportunity disparities, wage disparities are always some of the major drivers. Conflict, of course, is a major driver, and today one of the other big drivers is the environment. Environmental degradation exacerbated by climate change is becoming one of the predominant drivers of movement of people, largely internally within countries, but some cross-border. On migration and development, there was a lot of writing and a lot of thinking in the 60s about what's the relationship between these fields, and migration was largely seen as a problem, as a failure of development, a consequence of failure of development, and leading to brain drain from the developing countries where the best and the brightest whose educations had been paid for through public education systems were going off and spending that investment someplace else, not in their own countries. So migration was largely seen as a problem from a development perspective. And really leaving countries depleted of their best and brightest to help foster further development of the countries. In the last 10 years, there's been a massive sea change in the thinking about the relationship between migration and development. And I think it came really as a result of some work that the World Bank did initially, where in the early 2000s, 2003 or so, they started focusing on the amount of remittances, the money that people overseas earned and were sending back to their families at home. Now those, of course, are private funds. Those are not governmental resources. But in most cases, they far outstrip foreign direct assistance or official development assistance, even foreign direct investment. And so the scale of those capital flows was really quite significant and had major impact not only at the family level, in particular making it possible for people to invest in education, healthcare, and even job creation, but also at the community level, because a lot of the knowledge, the skills that was transferred as a result of it, not just financial remittances, but what we call social remittances, technology, knowledge, became a very significant factor. Now, I don't want to overstate this. It's important to recognize that according to UN estimates, there are 214 million international migrants in the world today. Those are people who've been outside their countries of origin for more than 1 year. And there are some 740 million internal migrants, people who migrate within their own country from region to region. China's probably the best example, where some of the internal migration to China looks a lot like some of the international migration in other parts of the world, including a lot of the challenges that are faced in terms of access to services, access to education, to healthcare, things of that sort. What this focus on the remittances really opened up that, plus the communications and transportations revolutions of the last half a century, where it's simply possible to know about opportunities in far-fetched places of the world and access them for relatively inexpensive means, and having networks that make that possible. So if there's a diaspora base in a country, that tends to serve as one of the most strong pull factors to bring other people. It's so much easier to consider a migration project or embark on migration if you're going to people who you know, or from the same language or the same community, and who will generally find a place for you, at least through that initial transition period. So migration has changed, because now it's not really anymore the one-way permanent migration of 50 years ago, where if people thought about migrating, they moved, never imagining that they were going to maintain contact with their homes or with their families, but rather that was a cut. Today's migration is much more complex and much more multi-directional. People stay connected emotionally, as well as financially and otherwise, to multiple places. And government policy hasn't necessarily kept up with that in terms of dual citizenship, multiple entry visas, and things like that, which we can talk about a little bit later. But people often feel themselves as part of more than one society, maybe sequentially, maybe at the same time, maybe in terms of their projections. And so that makes the relationship a very different one. I'm now serving as IOM's representative to the UN, and I want to tell you about the very first high-level dialogue in the General Assembly on International Migration and Development that took place in 2006. That's really late if you think about how much migration had been going on for a long time. But before that, migration was viewed as too divisive an issue to have governments come together and talk about it in a constructive way. That there were the countries of origin and the countries of destination, which largely divided on north-south developing lines, but not exclusively. What's happened now is a recognition that most countries are countries of migration, meaning they have people coming in, they have people going out, they have people transiting. Each country may be predominantly one of the aspects of three, but actually it's the rare country that is not a country of migration and actually all three simultaneously. And so, for example, in Mexico and Morocco are classic examples of this. Historically, countries of emigration, where government policy was very much focused on protecting their nationals overseas, gaining access for nationals overseas. Well, now Mexico, Morocco, many other countries also have migrants coming in, and they have to think about what kinds of rights and protections and policies they put in place with respect to the migrants there. And do they take a different perspective about their own citizens overseas than about the people, the foreign nationals who are in their own countries? So all of this means that the world is ripe for thinking about migration in a much more nuanced way, where there are real opportunities for collaboration between states, not only bilaterally, but regionally and globally, and also by really understanding each other's perspectives in a better way, and seeing themselves as all in the migration situation and needing to address it. Let me give you just a couple, I know I'm short on time, so I'm going to give you a couple of numbers that might catch your attention. I mentioned those remittances. Let me tell you quickly, in 2010, the World Bank reported $440 billion in remittance flows. That's through IMF statistics. And the overwhelming majority of that went to persons in developing countries, so $325 billion of that $440 billion. These are underestimates, without a doubt, because those are only officially reported remittance flows. There's clearly much more that goes informally in cases when people travel, otherwise, but all through private transmitting. But it's even more significant if you think about the social lenses that people bring, the ideas, the investment, the ways of looking at the world, the empowerment of women, the empowerment of people to have opportunities. In some cases, remittances constitute up to 35% of the gross domestic product of the company. So those skills, those financial resources that get transferred are really, really quite significant. I'm not going to argue for breaking down complete barriers to the movement of people. There's a lot of econometric modeling and a lot of folks who have said that would be the single best breaking down the barrier to the free movement of goods, services, and capital. If you could impose more free movement of labor, that would produce the greatest global development gains. I'm not going to give you the numbers on that, but just to tell you, I don't think it's likely that we're going to see national boundaries being eliminated completely. But one thing to work toward would be to work toward a more realistic assessment of labor migration needs, more treating legal labor channels for migration, because it is protected migrants who migrate with legal status, who have rights and abilities to enforce them in their destination countries, who are best empowered to be able to contribute not only to the destination countries, but also back to their countries of origin. So rights are absolutely essential in this equation, and that's where I hope we get to in the next years. I'll stop now and just tell you the reason the next year or so is going to be important. I mentioned there was a 2006 high-level dialogue on international migration and development in the UN. The second one ever will take place next year, 2013. And there's really a hope that the international community can start moving toward better systems, better rules, more solid cooperation to make migration a more positive experience for more people and minimize the risks associated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A hard act to follow. I'll try my best. Maybe just to start off with a sort of the human face of migration. 2 years ago, we were working on a project in Indonesia, still going on today, looking at domestic workers. And we went to Terminal 3 in Jakarta, it's a separate terminal for migrants who are either leaving or coming back in the process. And we were filming a young lady named Dewey, and she had been approached by a very well-dressed woman who said, "It's a wonderful job for you in Saudi Arabia, you make lots of money, look around here, you'll see your neighbors, they've had remittances coming back, they're buying businesses, and they're building bigger houses and stuff." So there's a real big attraction for that. And as we spoke a bit more to Dewey, she started telling us the story of her unfortunate stay as a domestic worker in Saudi Arabia. She had burn marks from iron. She had claw marks on her back from the owners of the household. They accused her of stealing extra food. They actually locked her under the stairs with the dog and made her eat out of the same bowl. So here was a woman who was told that she's going to have this wonderful life, she's going to really change the life of her family, but yet the conditions in which she found herself in once she arrived in the destination country were less than attractive and less than humane. So sometimes that is the face of migration. It's not always the case. There are other people who have very good experiences, but as you can imagine, the International Labour Organization, we are concerned about the most vulnerable. From the ILO perspective, labor is not a commodity. People are not wood, they're not metal. They have dreams, aspirations, they have families. They want to move because they want their family to do better. You sitting here today, you are here because you want to have a better life for yourself, your children, and their children. It's a universal aspiration. So people have to be treated with those aspirations. Also, migrant workers have the dignity inherent in all human beings. These are the full rights that are entitled in all the international instruments, and particularly the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the ILO in particular focuses on decent work. And decent work looks at opportunities for all men and women, including migrant workers, to obtain productive and freely chosen work in conditions of freedom, equity, security, and human dignity. Very simple, very basic, but very, very important. We know the process of globalization is driving migration today, and we see migration largely as labor migration. The numbers were mentioned that you have 214 million migrants across the international borders. 105.4 million of those are economically active. The remainder of those with their families comprise 90% of the migration flows internationally. So we see it, again, mostly as labor migration. Contemporary forms of migration are changing. In the past, people would migrate because they would want to have longer-term immigration. They want to be permanent residents in other countries. Today we see sort of new reforms coming about. Migration for seasonal work, skilled migration, you have student migration, you have women migrating on their own, looking for employment. And there's also migration through irregular situations such as trafficking and smuggling and other means. What does migration look like? You have the south-north, which we traditionally know, that's about 33% of migrants today. You also have south-south migration, that's about 32% of the migrants today. They're normally living in contiguous countries next to one another. North migration, it's mostly is the United States, Canada, and you'll see that in Europe. But also you'll see the north-south migration. As companies start to open up operations in other countries, you need managers who are going to be operating those factories or training people on the ground. So migration involves all of us. Migrants usually are coming at the top and the bottom of the employment ladder. So skilled migrants who are coming, software engineers, people who have business degrees, people such as yourselves who will be traveling around the world and taking on higher level jobs. But also you have the people on the lower end, the low skills, and these are the people who are most vulnerable because they normally take the more demeaning, degrading, and dangerous jobs. And this is what we are worried about, which is the labor market segmentation. These are considered migrant jobs. These are jobs for those people. And again, they become objectified and in some ways becoming subhuman. Irregular migration is a major concern for us because if the demand is not being met through the formal channels, people will find a way. It's like water. If you do not find a way here, you will find another way. People have self-exploitation. You find people who may pay to be smuggled to another country, and they'll sacrifice their life so that their child will do better, and it may take them many years to pay back a smuggler for that. Other people may be trafficked. Trafficking of human beings is a huge industry right now. I think in the area about $32 billion that we've estimated so far that are being generated by people who are a bit unscrupulous. International cooperation is needed, and the UN and the International Labour Organization and a number of other organizations, IOM as well, we're working to find ways in which to develop legal channels for migration to happen. What are the other concerns that we have? Well, the countries of origin are worried about brain drain. The best and the brightest are going elsewhere. How are you going to contribute to the development of your own country? Now, we do see people going back home after a while, spending 5, 10, 15 years in another country. People want to go back home and contribute to development, or there are opportunities, and they feel maybe more comfortable. We see sometimes in this, now during the economic crisis, where migrants are not coming here because situations have gotten better back in their countries themselves. Maybe the former wave of migrants who have gone had sent money back, so you have businesses that are being started, that you have development moving forward. So there are greater opportunities, greater innovations that are taking place there. So the ILO maintains that migration is a rights-based approach, that it's not only an ethical and human rights imperative, but it's also an economic necessity. Migrants contribute to all sorts of economic and social and cultural advancements in the country. I usually joke around when I talk to people who say, I'm from New York, and say, you know, what is the most popular American food? They'll say Chinese food, or they'll say pizza. So we are a country of migrants. I myself, my family is from Ireland. I'm one of those people who have migrated. Well, my grandparents have migrated, and I'm here today, fortunately. The ILO is a normative agency, which means that we create international conventions. The ILO, since its founding in 1919, we were created after the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations and the ILO were the two international institutions. The League of Nations, as you know, failed, but became the United Nations eventually. But the ILO has been in operation since 1919. And in our Constitution, it says the protection of the interests of workers when employed in other countries than their own is within the ILO's purview. So this has always been on the agenda for the ILO. We've had the Declaration of Philadelphia in 1944. We have the Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights of Work, which mean that every worker in the world, regardless if you're a migrant worker or not, that you should enjoy the freedom of association and collective bargaining, that you should not be forced or compulsory labor, that child labor should not exist either, because if families are moving, the children themselves may be trapped. If they're irregular migrants and they're not fitting into society, or society doesn't allow them opportunity, children are not going to school, they'll have to do something. They're not just going to be sitting at home. So we want to avoid that situation. And also non-discrimination, which I think is one of the most important aspects. And I think for discrimination, we don't really think about discrimination until it affects us. And a small story, I was just on the train ride over here, and I was coming, and I realized I had a bag from a deli in New York that said, I heart New York. So here I am in Boston with my I love my New York bag, and somebody came on the train and said, all these bloody tourists who are coming in here today. We've used another word, but I felt a bit offended. But the ILO has a number of other provisions. In addition to the conventions, there is a convention on the migration for employment. We also have the private employment agencies. I mean, this is quite important because you have employment agencies themselves, which are actually, not all of them, but there are a number of them that are tricking people. They are deceiving people. They are telling them, we have a wonderful job for you to go here. And then when the person goes to that location to sort of claim the job, their passport is taken away. They are driven in a car, they are taken either by road or they're taken by airplane to a country other than the destination that they thought they would be going to. And in trafficking, a lot of young women get trapped into the sexual industry as well too. So the recruitment agencies themselves need to be monitored. They want, the higher end agencies obviously want to have protections because it's in their interest to do so. But again, it is having a shared responsibility not only at the international but at the national level as well too. Right now, the ILO's sort of main focus is the multilateral framework on labor migration. I think we've handed out that to you. So if you have any particular issues, take a look at that. I think it's a very instructive document as well too. It's rather broad and it'll give you some general guidelines, but I think that's actually quite important to set the parameters of the work relationship itself. I've got a lot of notes to cover, but I'll just give a few more because I think I'm going to run out of time here. But migrant workers, we know, make significant contributions. We've heard about remittances. I think the figure that I had seen from the World Bank was 351 billion, but it's still the same number. But most of these remittances that are going back to the countries of origin, usually developing countries, are going towards improved housing, they're going towards nutrition, they're going towards schooling, they're going towards healthcare. So it's creating human capital. So it's improving the situation. I mean, that's what the UN system is about, is to improve the economic situations. But the people themselves are doing it. They're creating their own opportunities for advancement. So protecting the rights of migrants is actually quite important because they also contribute to the country in which they are living and working themselves. Their money is going in to pay for that social security. Their money is going in, they're buying goods and services. So, you know, there is tremendous benefits that migration has on the society writ large. Some of the challenges for the future, what we're looking at is job matching across borders on a flexible basis. You know, how do you create opportunities for people to use the channels themselves that provide them with regular status? Irregular status, people are not protected by law. If somebody is in a job and that employer decides, well, we had a contract for $100 a month, well, we're going to give you $10. And if you don't like it, where do you go? Your passport may not be with you. You then considered illegal. We don't like to use the word illegal because people are not illegal from a human rights point of view. They may be irregular, they may be undocumented, but they are not illegal themselves. South-south migration. You know, this is, you have to set up good migration governance institutions, and this is happening. And I think the discussions that are going on at the UN and a number of other organizations are really trying to ensure that there is some supervision and oversight. The issues of competition for global talent. If you ask any of the recruiters today, what they're looking for is innovation and talent. And that can come from anywhere. It's not only the purview of the United States or England or so. You have talent innovation everywhere. How to prevent the segmentation of the markets. This is just a migrant worker's job. I mean, I'm from New York, and I see as I drive down the street, every street corner, there will be groups of men waiting to be picked up to do a day's job. Maybe they're given $30 or $40 a salary. It's, we have to be very careful because when you start creating an underclass, that's when we start to lose, I think, our perspective on what it means to be the value of work. The portability of Social Security rights and migration. Certainly, Social Security is important. If you lose your job, do you have unemployment insurance? Well, no, if you're in a regular job. If you are internal, I think in China, for example, when you're coming from the west into the east, because you're not from that province, your pensions are not directly translatable back. So there are some national problems that need to be addressed. And I think the last one that we're just looking at is learning from the mistakes of the past. How do we improve and learning from ourselves? There's a great deal of literature that's out there. One of the things to draw your attention to is that last year we have passed at the International Labour Organization Convention 189 for domestic workers. Domestic workers is a huge category of workers. I think the modest number is about 50 million people. Most of them are international, and most of them are women. So if we really want to look after the most vulnerable, and it's important because this is now getting into the sort of the informal economy. Before, our conventions usually dealt with people with a formal economy. When you're in the formal economy, it's very, very hard to protect people. It's very, very hard to provide people with the opportunity for a standard life for themselves because they are worried that they're going to be arrested or they're going to be thrown out of the country. So, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
that, let's take it back to the U.S. since we know that bring
well,
that into the conversation.
Well, first of all, as an ardent fan of the car talk, before your fair city gets a bad name about treating tourists, I want to tell you that someone in Boston subway system helped me buy my Charlie car today. So it's not always a bad reception in this great city. Anyways, to sort of being the only panelist here to talk about the U.S., and I know in situations like this is always a difficult task. You know, we generally end up saying the most unpopular things on any issue, but someone got to do their job. So here is sort of the U.S. perspective, at least from where I have seen the immigration debate evolve over time. I mean, I think it's first of all no surprise to any one of you that immigration has become one of the most dominant public policy and one of the most politically contentious issues of our times. And the need for a revision, a review of our immigration policy has been evident for at least 15 years. Equally evident has been that it's been very difficult to find a legislative solution, and has always been elusive. And you know, there are obviously lots of reasons. It's a combination of facts, policy, and politics, like most public policy issues are. But in immigration, I think it has become a very toxic combination. And we don't have time to dwell on each aspect of this. Let me just highlight the facts, because I do think facts are incredibly important to this debate. As you all waved in the beginning of this presentation, we all think of ourselves as a nation of immigrants. That's the uniquely American thing. Let me tell you, we have never been more a nation of immigrants. There are 40 million foreign-born people in the United States today. The largest it ever has been in our history. The decade of the 1990s, which continued into the first decade of the 21st century, we took more immigrants than in any 2 decades in our history. In fact, we are in the middle of a mass migration wave, the parallel of which was only at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, which we now equate as the first great wave of migration. So essentially, we began the 20th century with the way we ended it, with 2 big sort of building blocks of mass migration on the 2 sides. We also know that immigration is no longer a big 6-state phenomenon of New York, California, New Jersey, Illinois, Texas, and Florida. If you really look at where the growth of immigration is happening in the last 15 years, it's not in those states, it's in the new destination states of the country, from Iowas and Georgias and Tennessees and the Oklahomas and the Arizonas of the world, where obviously politics is playing a very different role. The third and most important part about this is that we have never seen so much component of our total migration to be unauthorized. If I had a chart, and if I was smart enough to bring my chart, if you look at the total foreign-born population of the United States today, it's exactly 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 of naturalized citizens, lawful permanent residents, and unauthorized. We have never seen in our immigration history such a large proportion of the foreign-born population to be unauthorized. And there are 7 states in the country today where the unauthorized actually outnumber the authorized lawful permanent residents. So the kind of political reaction that you're seeing from those states is not obviously something that can be ignored or cannot be understood. So these facts at the global level, I think most of us. What is less appreciated are the facts about our labor market. If you look at our overall labor market, we are 16% of our labor market is foreign-born. If you look at the low-skilled occupations of our country, which by definition are occupations which require less than a high school degree, about 48% of our labor force is foreign-born. If you look at the low-wage sector of our economy, which by definition is occupations which pay less than twice the federal minimum wage, about 26 to 27% of our labor force is foreign-born. And if you really look at the future trends of the labor market, people will tell you that the increasing demand is going to come from the low-end, the low-skilled, and the low-wage sector of our economy. How did this happen in our very midst, in the phenomenon that's not known to most of the country? A large number of factors are responsible for it. We don't have time to dwell on it. Let me just identify 4. First of all, despite the fact that all academics and all members of Congress in the beginning of the 1990s will tell you, U.S. will no longer need low-wage sector jobs in our country. They all belong to the third world. What we should become are job creators of people in the finance sector, or people in the Silicon Valley. We need computer geeks to come to the United States. The rest of the jobs we can say, well, guess what happened? In the last 2 decades, the biggest job growth we happened in our country was the low-wage sector of our economy. These are infant care people, these are elder care people, these are home care people, these are people who work as janitors in the service sector of the economy, people who work in the agriculture, and people who work in the construction industry. Okay, so the high growth happened in these sectors of the economy. Now you say, why did that happen? And again, many reasons for that. One is obviously that we have had globalization has an impact. The introduction of many of our free trade agreements between U.S. and Mexico and then concurrently with other countries of the world have had their own impact on the migration streams. Unionization in the country has gone down. And finally, we have essentially, for a good 15 years, gave up on labor law enforcement in our country. There are less inspectors at the Department of Labor today than they were in 1975. The Obama administration just increased it by 250 people, which has sort of got it to a respectable level. But it's obviously nowhere near what the demand for that is. Second is that we have become, not a lot of people acknowledge, we have become an aging society. That I think most of you know that 78 million baby boomers started retiring in 2001. About 10,000 baby boomers retire a day in our country today. By 2020, all the baby boomers, about 50, they'll be about a good chunk of them will be 55. By the year 2030, all baby boomers will be over the age of 65. By the year 2030, it's believed that 1/3 of American population will be over the age of 55. These are hard facts. Now, labor economists of all sides do not dispute any of this thing. So once you have obviously aging society, you need a different group of people to come and sort of accommodate for the labor market needs of the society. The third factor, which again getting lost, is we have become a more educated society. The same factor that I talked about at the beginning of the 20th century, only 10% of Americans graduated high school at the beginning of the 20th century. Today, only 15% of Americans don't graduate high school. So in such short period of time, we have become more educated society, which is great, obviously, for the country, but it has impact on the labor market, because someone who's a high school graduate, his ambition is not to flip hamburgers at a restaurant or to go and work in the fields of the country. So therefore, a combination of these factors has made a big growth in the low-wage sector of the economy, and fewer Americans are either available or willing to do the job. And this is sort of where immigrant labor has come to fill the gap. So the obvious question was, if this is something that is so obvious to every person, why aren't these people coming legally? So this is where we then get to the broken system of our immigration, that we have today a selection system on our immigration law, which is based on 1950s architecture for a 21st century global economy, and obviously does not work. Just to put it in context, we have only 5,000 visas available for all low-wage sector economic occupations for the whole world. So you can imagine, therefore, the laws of supply and demand are working magically, except that illegal channels are being used increasingly to meet the demand. So these are basic facts. So the issue is, what do we do with this dilemma? So not too much time left here, but let me say the policy prescription from it. First, you have to do something with the present unauthorized population. 11.2 million people in the country with no rights is neither good for them, nor is it good for our country. Most of these people are productive members of society, they pay taxes, many of them have deep roots in our society, and frankly, we don't have the wherewithal to tap 11.2 million people and deport them countries of origin. We will never be a country like that. So in the absence of that, we have to bite the bullet and legalize these people as effectively, as quickly, and in an organized way as we can. But just taking care of the existing population does not solve the problem for the future. But just because we legalize it doesn't mean people in the future will not be needed or will not come. So therefore, we have to develop a legal structure for admission of new workers into our labor market. And that must be informed, mostly important, by something that we do about the rights and protections of workers, both for US workers and for foreign workers. And we must do it which is also consistent with the true values of our society. So these are the outlines, and then we have to decide what numbers these should be. These are the outlines of what we believe a decent labor flow policy for the future of the country should be. First is that what's the structure? As I think it was alluded to, but we have essentially at some level various segments of our labor market. I mean, the people who are truly exceptional, I mean, for lack of any other word, the Einsteins of the world, where we know we need them tomorrow at the shortest, they should be able to come as quickly any place they want to go without any bureaucratic hassle. But that's not what most of the labor market will do. The rest of the labor market is what we call garden variety immigrants. And we believe that those people should come through a mechanism we call provisional workers. That no one should come on the first day saying, I want to live in this country for the rest of my life. That world has changed significantly from that time. That people should come as provisional workers sponsored by an employer. And they should be allowed to stay for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, they have to make a decision, do they want to go back to their country of origin or do they want to stay for another 3 years. And during that time, they should be able to move from one employer to the other. Because being bonded to one employer is obviously the problem that is created in the context of the imbalance between the power of the employer and the employee. Secondly, at the end of 6 years, they should be able to adjust their status to permanent residence. And those who choose to go back, we should have an arrangement by bilateral agreements between our country and that country, let's say Mexico, that any amount of money they remit to Social Security should be kept in the deposit so that they can be credited for that in Mexico. If they ever decide to come back, we should give them credit for that. The second component of this is what should be the rights and protections. Rights are obviously very important. We, first of all, believe that no US workers should lose their job if we import a foreign worker. There should be significant labor market tests developed which are efficient and true to the measurement of the shortage of workers. And people should have access to courts, they should have access to lawyers to defend their rights, which they don't have in the temporary worker program that we have. And lastly, how many people should be selected? We believe the present system freezes you in a legislative model which cannot be changed for years. And therefore, right now, the numbers were decided in 1990, 25 years ago, that we should really have a commission, like the Federal Reserve Commission. We change interest rates in our country every quarter, but we can't change the numerical limits of immigration for 25 years. Just does not make sense. That this should be a highly technical commission which is staffed by real economists, whatever that term means, who will determine the labor market needs of our country based on our shortages and for our economic growth. And this number should change every 2 years. And if we know something happened in the last 2 years of our 3 years of our recession, is that in a bad time we will reduce immigration, as we have done in the last 3 years. Actually, so I think this is sort of the framework for a future immigration policy, and a policy that we all can be proud of. We have to, despite the fact that politics is not allowing for it to happen today, I do believe it's our collective obligation to move this debate forward, because we can't turn back the clock on this. And when we do that, we should do it with full acknowledgement of the contributions of immigrants to our history and to our future, and they must ultimately be reflective of the optimism that defines this country. Thank you.
All right, great. 3 very insightful observations from our panelists. And before we turn it open to the audience for questions, and I hope that we do have about 25 minutes to engage in a conversation, I actually wanted to take the moderator's prerogative and engage you in a conversation. It's clear that we've talked about some of the push factors, the pull factors. We focused a lot on the positive impacts in terms of remittances and the social remittance and the financial remittance and the technological remittance, about some of the barriers to enforcement and the challenges. I want to be thinking about who are really the actors that rights of the people that are at the margins. So not the Einsteins, but the low-wage workers of the garden variety, and in particular to focus not just on government, but on business, What is the role of business, whether it's transnational corporations, when they're looking who they're employing themselves or their supply chains, these small-scale vendors, and then even for labor themselves, because traditionally, organizing has been one role for the formal economy, but that is not something that we often see people that are living in the margins able to access for a variety of reasons. So I'd like to maybe ask you to comment on this, and in doing so, you could even pick up on some of the other remarks that your colleagues have made.
Thank you, Sharmila, and I'll be brief. I think what we say at IOM is that migration, not it takes a village, but it takes a whole world. And basically, it's a whole of society approach that's needed. Because of course, the employers are often the first ones. You need to have mechanisms at that level, and obviously the labor laws need to be enforced as applied. But beyond that, it's really where migrants interact with society. And one thing we haven't talked about is that migration brings social change. And social change can be frightening when people are different and people are the other. And that needs to, I'm not suggesting that we stop it, but rather that we recognize that those are somewhat natural human phenomena and they have to be managed, which means that you have to raise awareness in local communities, in schools, in hospitals, to provide migrant-sensitive health care. So where there may be different practices, you've got to adjust to be able to accommodate different people with different values, different understanding. Same in church and community groups. I mean, it really takes managing the entire societal interaction with migrants so that it can be a positive force, not only for the individuals, but for the societies that accept them. So we really do have to go well beyond thinking about just government as the principal policymakers and find ways to engage all the various different actors and stakeholders in society to engage in the process of managing this social change if it's to be possible.
Well, I think the managed immigration obviously is important because this sort of gets you into which you sort of teasingly asked us to comment about, should we have open borders or not? I just don't think open borders are the solution to this phenomenon, despite the fact that some, I think, economists, serious economists say that we probably have fewer illegal immigrants in our country today if we left the border with Mexico open than we have today. But I think the political reality is we will, as long as we live in a world of nation states, sovereignty and attribute of sovereignty will be able to control our borders. I happen to believe also, it may sound very strangely normative as a lawyer, there's Constitution. The Constitution applies only to the borders of the country. When any member of the ACLU tells me the U.S. Constitution will apply to Guatemala, then I might begin to say why we should have universal rights. I mean, these are basic realities of our political discourse. So managed immigration, I think, is extremely important because if people do not have some sense that they have some control over the phenomenon, the consensus for immigration disappears. Really, I mean, the fact that there's so much strong reaction at the political level in our country because just people can't believe why do we have 12 million unauthorized? How did this thing happen? When we're supposed to control this at the border, if we can't control it, don't tell me that you can control this in the future. So that's not why that's not going to give me good reason to support a legalization. So that's one, controls it. Second thing, I do think that some old reality about this phenomenon has really changed. People would tell you that U.S. does this the best. We have really done it best because the government has been hardly involved. Except for deciding in Washington, D.C. who should come in and under what numbers, we leave the rest of the society to the debate, to the laissez-faire method of saying, people come in, we figure they themselves decide where to go. The government is least interested and involved in this, and we have done so well, so something that's not broken, don't fix it. The problem is, it's not what it used to be. That just given the numbers that I was talking at the beginning, you can't say that this is business as usual. That you can't say that anyone who arrives in New York City is going to find a way to a hospital, to a school, to a job. That world has essentially disappeared. So there is clearly increasing role for the government. But that role has to be a really minimalist. It really has to be able to facilitate the civil society. This integration of immigrants, which is another component where we have a huge problem. We have highly developed policies about immigration. Highly developed. Who we come in, under what circumstances. We have a patchwork and totally underdeveloped and under-resourced policies about what do we do with people after they get here. So this is sort of what immigration versus the immigrant debate, as some of our colleagues would like to call it. So we need to have a better immigrant debate, in which the employers are very critical, because especially the labor-based immigration, they have to take much more serious responsibility. And frankly, if we're going to give them access to workers from all over the world, they better do this with integrity, which has been lacking, frankly. So they've seen their responsibility so far only as consumers of labor, but not as effective. And that has to change. And we frankly need a legal system which allows people to enforce that right. I mean, telling people you have a right to go to the Department of Labor means nothing if there's no one at the Department of Labor who can take it from them. And if you cannot take your own lawyer to a court to enforce your rights. And that has to change.
Thank you. I think just two quick points. In terms of the actors, as I mentioned before, it is a shared responsibility. I mean, of course, we believe that the government has the right to develop and manage its migration policy. But I think that you can learn a lot from other experiences. And this is what I was mentioning before about learning our lessons from the past, what we've done right, what we've done wrong. So it is not only just the government, but it's civil society. It is the workers and employers themselves. It's also the media. It's the researchers. We need more information about the nature, the changing nature of migration today. So there are many different actors that come into play, and I think that's quite an important lesson to learn. The other sort of focus for the ILO is about social dialogue. Social dialogue is really any form of communication between management and workers themselves. And that's absolutely essential in any modern workplace today. We have seen sort of freedom of association under attack. We see collective bargaining under attack. Now, these are absolutely the essential principles for a fully effective and operating economic system. You need to have, for example, freedom of association is underpinned by some basic freedoms, and you'll probably hear these in other documents. Freedom of association is about freedom of opinion. Freedom of association is about freedom of assembly. It's about freedom of speech. It's about security of person. I mean, we've fought these battles, back in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s in the United States. It's being played out in many other countries today. When workers and employers sit down at the table and they discuss the issues that are affecting both of them, that's the collective bargaining process. This is a process of dialogue and negotiation between the management and the workers to reach an agreement on workplace issues, such as wages and benefits, such as conditions of work, contractual arrangements. If it's an unbalanced power relationship where the worker has absolutely no say in the matter, it's going to be a dysfunctional system. So I think what we're looking at here is that social dialogue plays an absolutely essential part for the effective functioning of work today. And when work is out of balance, that's when you see these sort of masses of irregular migration coming in, because there's still that demand to hire people. But if there aren't the channels to bring them in, if they don't have a voice in the workplace, they can be manipulated, they can be exploited. So you have to have the voice in the workplace. And for us, social dialogue is an absolutely essential part of today's management work relations.
Great, thank you. Would anybody from the audience like to ask a question? Please.
I have a question.
There's a microphone.
I'll turn it on. Hi, my name is Vanessa, and I'm a student from Columbia University. I have a question about the internal migration that you just brought up. I'm curious about, in this type of migration, which is largely happening within national border, what's the role of international organizations? Like, how much are you involved in this type of ensuring rights of migrants in this type of immigration? And also, could you perhaps give an example where you work perhaps in collaboration with the local and national actors? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, we'll take a couple questions and then we'll get back.
Hello, I'm Jennifer. I'm here at Harvard. I was curious, I had a question for you. You mentioned some way of distinguishing at a policy level between those who are considered Einsteins and those who are considered garden variety. And how do you determine who is who? I mean, to give a personal anecdote, my best friend was an undocumented immigrant. He crossed the border 7 times and was deported. He is now here doing his PhD at Harvard, finishing up. How do you determine? I mean, he spent years in the fields. How do you determine who is who at a policy level?
Great, we'll take one more and then we'll open it up to the panel. Right here in front, please.
My name is Sebastian Modak with the Legato Center at MIT. I had a question about remittances specifically. I feel like remittances occur for the most part despite of governments and boundaries set up by governments. And I'm wondering if any of you foresee or envision a role of governments in whether it's streamlining remittances by taking out fees or through hometown associations, or are we better off without having governments involved so that it's ensured that that money ends up in the pockets of families and not in the pockets of government?
Thank you. 3 very great questions.
Sure. Actually, I might start with that last one first, if you don't mind. I think you're right. I mean, we have to remember remittances are private funds, and sometimes the best thing to do is to get governments out of the way. One of the really positive developments in the last 10 years is that remittance markets have opened up quite a bit. And there's more competition, which means that the transaction costs associated with transmitting remittances have gone way down in many cases. So there's been a deliberate effort in many societies to open up competition there. But that's also come, and we've seen fees go on average from 20% of the, down to, on average, lower than 10%, and even lower in some cases. But at the same time, in the post-9/11 world, there's more regulation of financial transactions for security reasons. And so there's a real tension now between wanting very broad competition and getting government out of this to really create less expensive remittance channels and needing to monitor where funds flow internationally. There have been some very interesting government programs to foster remittances while retaining their fundamentally private character. And one of the most interesting, most well-known is one in Zacatecas in the region of Mexico, where the 3+1 or now the 4+1, basically for every dollar remitted, the local community, the state government, and the federal government all tops off with an additional dollar. And that's designed to effectively stimulate not only more remittance, but remittance investment in productive social outcomes. As Kevin said earlier, the majority of remittances really go to the household level and to deal with basic needs, and that's terribly important in reducing poverty, health, for food, for education. But there's also a desire to look at that, to produce productive things beyond consumption that not only invest in the individual well-being, but really create longer-term effects for society. Philippines has done some really, and local communities have done some really interesting work about community centers, hospitals, or things where groups of Filipinos in the diaspora have gotten together to want to do that. And again, not so much from the government, but really an individual initiative. So I think there has to be a bit of fundamentally recognizing that remittances are private funds, but and not taxing them in a different way. And there have been proposals several years ago about creating a remittance tax that would then go to governments and then would create effectively a new form of foreign aid. That's been pretty well rejected as not creating the right incentive system. So balance between those issues. Coming back to the first question about internal migration for a moment. And the numbers I gave you were really quite staggering, showing that internal migration is much higher than international migration. And of course, it's a very different thing. When people are within their own nation states, the government has the principal responsibility, and there's generally speaking been tremendous reticence by national governments to allow international efforts domestically. Labor law is actually one of the best entry points, and I hope Kevin will speak more about that. But I know we've started working with the government of China, who's asked us to do several studies about internal migration, same in other areas where there are very large patterns and where some of the issues that arise are very comparable to the kinds of issues that arise in international migration. What lessons can be learned that can be utilized that way? But it's a much more sensitive context and much harder to work, because you have to work basically with the consent of and at the request of.
Thanks. And Vivek, do you want to pick up on the labor point?
Sure. How to start? I have to tread very carefully. So I think maybe just using an example. We've seen recently in the newspaper about Foxconn and the concerns in that factory that are associated with Apple. And unfortunately, it usually takes a crisis to happen before people actually say, we must do something about this, even though many people are working on it for quite a long time. The ILO has a great deal of experience, almost 100 years experience in dealing with labor law. We know what works in a workplace, we know how to make things better, and we provide that advice. We're an international organization, we're not a supranational organization, so we can't impose the will on people. So we have a great deal of experience, we have a great deal of data, we have experts that can go and work with them. But it wasn't until workers were starting in large numbers to commit suicide, it wasn't until workers were being injured in the workplace for the world eyes to turn at them. And then why did it happen? Because Apple is such a well-known brand, and they are now in the spotlight. And the moment that a company like Apple is in the spotlight, or Nike for child labor and people start to say, well, do I want to support a company that's treating people like that? Because I think today's generation are more attuned to that. People want to know that I'm actually a good corporate and a good world citizen, that I expect the corporates to do the same thing as well too. So then the attention turned to them. Now, the Fair Labor Association, which is a fantastic organization, a non-governmental organization, went to the facilities in those 3 cities, and what they came out with was, I think, a fairly balanced report. I think they could have been a bit more in depth, but they're starting to make changes at the wage level, at the conditions of work level. I mean, when you have 22,000, 30,000, 35,000 people in dormitory settings working in a factory around the clock for 16 hours, 20 hours, not getting overtime pay, you have a lot of social problems. I mean, it happens all over the place. Now, we saw this in, for example, in Uganda, where you have the textile companies that were trying to take advantage of AGOA, the American Growth and Opportunity Act. And the factories that were there were not actually run by Ugandans. They were run by someone from another country coming there and using this sort of labor in the country. And the president, Museveni, had said, well, we want to use this as a poverty reduction scheme. So what they did is they took women from very sort of remote areas that were very poor and brought them together. Now, what you have is, certainly in Africa, and those who are either from Africa or have had experience there, is that just because it's one country doesn't mean that they're all of the same background or the same ethnicity or the same language. So you had people who spoke different languages, people who had different cultural customs themselves, all living together in one place. I mean, that creates a problem. How do you address that problem, especially if people have no voice within the workplace? So that's why, coming back to that freedom of association, social dialogue, social protection, how do we provide protections for people who are in the workplace if they are disempowered? Because it can't be just to say if you don't like the job that you should quit, because you don't have options. Sometimes there aren't options. And if a country wants to succeed, they have to use all of the resources in their country for economic development. And it is in their benefit to have an equitable distribution of that. So it is quite important to learn the lessons from international organizations, to work with them, build capacity with the workers and employers organizations in those countries so they understand better the mechanics and the dynamics of how to put together a modern workplace. So there is a great deal of support out there. It just means that the companies and the governments themselves have to ask for that help. And that's where we are. We have to be asked for that help. We can't impose ourselves on them.
Great. And before we turn to the Einstein garden variety question, let me just also say that some of you may be familiar with the business and human rights framework that was developed by the Special Representative to the UN. And there's some interesting research that's being done by Richard Block at MIT that goes to some of these questions around talking about compliance versus trying to think about creating shared value and looking at the whole supply chain and what are the real factors that lead to needing to have people living in dormitories so that they can make changes at the last minute. Let's turn to a different question about a really interesting one about how do you choose when you're a policymaker?
I mean, I have almost nothing to say about internal migration except to tell you the following, is that we generally assume that internal migration issues are provinces of other parts of the world. U.S. used to have a huge problem with internal migration. In fact, the legal structure of our protection for foreign workers came from how we treating migrant workers who did agricultural work going from one part of the country to the other. So when you look at models, you will look at that too. On Einstein, first of all, for Einstein gets abused all the time, the vocabulary, and I'm not sure, not just in the immigration context. The reason I chose Einstein because we have this highly strict moderator who would give us a little time. I would otherwise give you a long definition of what an extraordinary personal quality means. This is just a shorthand of defining someone who would be, by objective standards, someone that you're looking at evidence with significance. What I was making distinction wasn't that we should choose one over the other. All of us think about the pace of their migration to the United States, really strictly. In fact, the magic of immigration in the U.S. is that we take people of the whole spectrum. That we take physics professors and government workers, and we believe that they will contribute equally to the future of our country. That's been the uniquely defining thing about America. When we take a government worker, and I used to represent government workers, we don't just look at that person. We consider the possibility that a government worker may give birth to Colin Powell, or may give birth to Charlie Rangel. That's the magic of American immigration. So we like the whole spectrum. All I was saying is that you have to, once you decide, if we're going to take, let's say, 500,000 people a year under our construction now for labor migration, you have to decide how you're going to pick them, at what rate you're going to pick them. And I was saying that for that you have to devise a scheme. So the first picks in terms of the priority should go to people where any objective method would say, this person is truly needed for our country. And that has to be decided not by their past in terms of how many times they cross the border illegally, but what do they have to offer to the country today. And if that person has a PhD degree in a field that we know is going to help the country in various levels of our need, that person is extraordinary. That is determined by your qualifications and the sponsorship by an employer than the record of the person. And that doesn't mean the garden variety people will not come in. They will come, but behind that person is that they will, the first extraordinary people will get the first 20,000. After that, 480,000 people are inevitably going to go to the garden variety people. But they may take a little longer time to become permanent members of the society.
Great, thank you. And we only have a couple of minutes left, I think, until our panel's over. Okay, we can take 5 minutes. All right, great. So maybe let's take a couple more questions, and then we'll give each panelist just 1 or 2 minutes to just try to respond and close up at the same time. So back there in the back, please.
Hi, thank you. I had 2 quick questions. One, I know the International Immigration Organization has been leading one of the operations in Haiti about relocating the residents that are living on the tent cities. I'm wondering, what are the plans to make sure that those residents are being placed in semi or at least permanent homes that are sustainable, in sustainable communities where they can rebuild their lives? And second, I know, and everybody I'm sure also knows, that the immigration reform campaign here in the U.S. has taken a couple of steps back in the past couple of years with legislation such as the Arizona law and secure communities. What are some of the organizations on the table doing to make sure that just immigration reform is being drafted that takes into account the rights of immigrant communities?
Thank you. 2 good questions that are going to be hard to answer and briefly. We'll take a couple more.
Hi, my name is Gabriela, and I'm an international student at University of Pittsburgh. I'm from Romania originally. You've all hinted in the direction of this major paradigm shift where migration is seen as a positive thing towards development and then not the other way around. So I was wondering, where you see the role of diplomacy coming to that, and not necessarily at the high level, but at the citizen level, what is actually called citizen diplomacy, and like all those sister cities, and the idea of a global city is such a coveted title to have these days, and then going along with that, like the relationship between, and the challenge between migration and urbanization.
Great, thank you. And then right here at the team.
Thank you. My name is Adriana Ayala, and I'm from Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. I'm actually from San Diego, California, and I wanted to ask panelists, what is your creative way to solve the confiscation of vehicles with undocumented immigrants in California, and I believe also in Massachusetts and other parts of the country? What solutions do you bring as as representatives of your organizations that could allow for undocumented immigrants who are trying to live a good quality of life and work dignitely in this country in terms of the confiscation of vehicles because of not owning a driver's license? Thank you.
Great. And unfortunately, I don't think we have time for more questions, but I think the panelists will be around afterwards if you want to approach them. But we're going to be, just in the interest of not keeping you guys too late, we'll just give a minute or two for each person to just try and respond to what are some very important but challenging questions.
Well, let me just take the Arizona question and the confiscation question. They seem purely U.S. pathology. So I think on the Arizona stuff, I mean, we know why comprehensive immigration reform is not happening. I mean, it's frankly more politics than anything else. That it has now become so wrought, not just in small p politics, but big P politics, in sort of the partisan divide. That unless that changes, we are unlikely to see some major change. I talk about Arizona. I mean, as you know, Arizona law is being challenged at the Supreme Court. Supreme Court will rule in June. My guess is that if the Supreme Court rules in favor of the Arizona law, you will have a strong reaction in Arizona at a very grassroots level that potentially may change the electoral pattern of Arizona, and maybe the only state which is a potential changing from red to blue in the next election, which is what they are looking at. But issues of secure communities and all that, these are broader issues. What's happened in the last 15 years, so no, and we don't have enough time to do this, is that we have sort of increasingly there's a huge interconnection now between our criminal justice system and our immigration system, which is inevitably, no matter who the president of the United States is now going to be, unfortunately, is going to produce the same number of people in our removal proceedings. All that we can do now as advocates is to make sure that once people are put in proceedings, that we have some discretion in what people to remove and what not. And that discretion should be exercised on the basis of people who have attachments to the community, how long they have been here, as against the criminal behavior of people. We should target those people. So that's, I think, my activity. On the confiscation, I think this is an emerging reform in many states, is that just because you don't have driver's license doesn't mean that you have the right to take someone's property. I think these are increasingly be defended as property rights. And property rights status is not important to property rights. That you may stop the person from driving, but you cannot take over that person's car. And I think that is that the lawyers are defending those things on those grounds.
Great, thank you very much. Kevin, would you like to?
I'll give you the last word there. I don't know if I can answer any more of those questions there, except this idea of local solutions to me is actually quite interesting, because I think those who work in development realize that actually some of the best development solutions actually happen at the local level. And I think it's very important to allow the space for that to develop. The international community works primarily in terms of migration, the Global Migration Group, where the ILO and the IOM and 14 other UN agencies have been working together, drawing experiences from the national level and local level. So I think that there's a great deal of thought being given to this. I mean, of course, the political climate allowing for this to be resolved in a way that addresses the issue rather than being sort of overtaken by politics remains to be seen. But there is a need to adopt a more coherent, comprehensive approach to international migration, because as we know, globalization is not stopping, migration will not stop. It's going to continue throughout the next century and beyond. So with that, we need to look at more enhanced international policy coherence across a broad spectrum of development issues to ensure that we have an enabling environment for sustainable economic growth, so that that growth is actually fair and equitable for all citizens in all countries. Thank you.
That was great. That was was actually what I would have liked to have said. That was perfect. Let me come to the Haiti question specifically about relocating people. IOM was responsible for managing all the camps in Haiti after the earthquake, and there were 1.5 million people originally displaced. Fortunately, that number is down substantially. But we are very concerned about forcible evictions. I mean, people should not be forcibly evicted from the camps, and should only move when there's an opportunity to move to a place where the prospect is to really regain their lives and their livelihoods, to safe conditions, and a possibility of leading more effective lives. So we're doing a lot of reconstruction and a lot of advocacy on that, but remain very concerned, without a doubt. The numbers are way down, but they're not eliminated at all. Some of this has to do with property disputes in Haiti, some of it has to do with governmental policies, and we have to discuss that in more detail with you. On the overall, on the paradigm shift, absolutely getting down to the local level. There's great initiatives emerging about city-to-city collaboration and locality-to-locality. Even I'm aware of, for example, one of the most dangerous banlieues outside of Paris called Montreuil, which tends to be a slum area where there's a very large Malian community. The mayor of the town there has decided to create local citizenship for the citizens from Mali, even though they can't become French citizenships, to find ways to engage them and include them in a more regular way, recognizing that they're not leaving, and to have them isolated is, Kevin said before, is really disruptive, not only for the individuals, but for the community as a whole. So my last point, of moving forward is that we really need to get those local solutions. We need to look at not only reducing the cost of remittances, but at the end, to make migration more beneficial for development, but the upfront costs, and really reducing the abusive role of recruiters, smugglers, traffickers, so that migration can be safe, legal, and fair, and that the full benefits can flow. And I think that getting to those questions of better social inclusion, social protection, will be really critical in the future, so that migrants are not discriminated against, regardless of legal status. And that, not suggesting breaking down barriers, but we've got a long way to go to see migrants as persons deserving of full protection of their human rights. And that will be where we can integrate migration policy more effectively into development policy, human rights policy, environmental policy across the board, for the kind of inclusion that Kevin talked about. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Please thank me in joining what was really a fabulous panel. And I would also be remiss if I did not thank Litzy on the corner here for the brains behind this panel. So please also join me in thanking Litzy. And of course, many more questions, many more conversations to continue. So would encourage you to come up and speak with the panelists. Thank you. I need 1 minute here.
Yeah. So it'll be really unfair if our dynamic moderator doesn't get her dues. So she is obviously not Charlie Clements. She is Sharmila Murthy. She's a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, and she's a lawyer by profession. She is from Harvard Law School and our very own HKS alumni, and she has really worked on the grounds, like in her legal capacity, to protect the rights of migrant workers in the US, and she has also created a platform, a refugee and immigration project for legal empowerment. So she is very passionate about this cause, and which is why she's here, even when we called her in the last minute. So let me thank Sharmila Murthy with a small gift. I'm so glad that by the way, I come from a state called Kerala, in the second most populous country named India. And Kerala sends the largest number of migrant workers from India to whichever country is possible. And the thing is, I've seen how migrant workers easily become cash cows. And our state would have been bankrupt today if it were not for the migrant remittances. But the thing is, nobody takes accountability for their rights. And we in Harvard, and maybe in other Ivy League or any academic institutions, we know how migrant workers or the laborers easily become variables in the mathematical equation. Because we focus a lot of labor economics, we talk a lot about regression analysis, but what happens to their human rights? I mean, so it's high time that we start talking about labor rights and migrant labor rights from a human rights perspective. And I am the fortunate panel manager who could bring together this amazing panel, the experts in the labor and migrant rights field. And so I'm so excited that we have this conversation here. And they really kind of gave us such amazing thoughts and really, I mean, they really succeeded in kind of steering our thoughts in that direction. So I would like to thank Mr. Kevin Cassidy. Thank you for emphasizing the importance of social dialogue when we try to kind of pinpoint to one or two actors. And it's important that we as policymakers know that all the actors have equal responsibility to kind of bring about a solution. So thank you, Mr. Kevin Cassidy, for being here. Ms. Michelle Klein-Solomon just flew in from Geneva yesterday, and we kind of grabbed her to attend this panel. We didn't give her time to kind of rest or anything. And she's a permanent observer to the UN, permanent observer of UN to the IOM. We're very glad that you gave such a good overview about IOM and the role it can play in addressing the issue of migrant labor rights. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. We're so glad that you're here today. Tran!
It's here. It's here.
Oh,
Thank you.
sorry.
No need for the space.
So, Dr. Chishti really spiced up our panel discussion with the garden variety and the Einstein. So, thank you very much for really kind of making us think in different directions. Thank you so much, Dr. Chishti, for being here. Thank you very much, Sandra. Thank you very much, audience.
I will.
How's it do?
Hey, it's going really well. I'm enjoying it.